They laughed when he stepped into the arena, a broke veteran with a battered saddle, leading a monster of a horse that no one believed could even walk straight. The crowd smelled blood. They wanted a joke, a spectacle, something to laugh at and forget by lunchtime. But what they got instead was a story that would tear their world apart. A performance that silenced every jeer, shattered every expectation, and turned 1,000 laughing faces into masks of pure, unadulterated shock. Before we dive into how it all went down, do us a favor and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you enjoy this story, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button. The Kansas horizon was a knife's edge, a straight, merciless line of dry earth and bleached sky that seemed to swallow everything whole. For Jack Mercer, the silence of that land was a constant scream. He was a man built for the thunder of war, for the harsh mountains of Afghanistan, where the air tasted of dust, diesel, and the permanent threat of explosion. Now, back in his home state, the only sound was the lonely whistle of prairie wind through fences that were more rust than wire. War lived in Jack's body. A deep, jagged scar puckered his left shoulder, a permanent reminder from a piece of shrapnel that had tried to tear him in two. It ached when the weather turned, a dull, grinding pain, as if the storms of Kansas were conspiring with the storms in his head. His legs, once quick and sure, carried a faint, stubborn limp, the legacy of a blast wave that had thrown him like a rag doll and nearly ended his world. But the worst wounds were the ones you couldn't see. Nights were the enemy. He'd jolt awake, drenched in cold sweat, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The phantom echoes of mortar rounds and the distant thin screams of men he couldn't save would claw their way through the quiet farmhouse walls. Sleep was a stranger. It came in short, jagged bursts, leaving him hollow-eyed and frayed by dawn. When he walked through the small town nearby, picking up odd jobs, fixing fences for folks who looked right through him, loading hay bales at the co-op, he felt the stares. Some looked with pity, others with a polite indifference that was somehow worse. He'd catch himself thinking the same dark thought over and over. They've forgotten. The whole country moved on, and I'm still stuck here. I don't fit anywhere anymore. The farm hadn't been a choice. It was an inheritance of dust and debt. His parents had passed while he was deployed, leaving him the Mercer homestead, a tired piece of land on the edge of nowhere that was older than he was. By the time he came home, the place was a skeleton. Fences leaned at drunken angles, barbed wire sagging into the dirt. The barn, once a proud red, had faded to a brittle, sun-bleached grey, its planks warped and its roof sagging like a tired old man. The farmhouse itself groaned with every gust of wind. Leaks stained the ceilings like old maps of forgotten rivers, and the porch steps threatened to give way under his weight. He stood on that porch the day he got back, his daughter Emma's small hand gripping his. She was 14 then, the last anchor keeping him from drifting away completely. Her eyes were too old for her age, filled with a quiet resilience that Jack both admired and feared. Her mother, his wife, had been taken by sickness years earlier, leaving the two of them to carve a life out of the scraps the world left behind. Their days were a simple grinding routine. Mornings started with black coffee for Jack and a quick bowl of cereal for Emma before she caught the yellow school bus at the end of their long, dusty drive. Jack took whatever work he could find, mending machinery for neighbors, hauling feed sacks until his scar burned. The pay was barely enough to keep the lights on, but Emma never complained. She'd spend her evenings sketching in a battered notebook, drawing the things she wished were there instead of the empty fields. She drew horses, magnificent and wild, instead of the empty, broken-down corral outside their window. Someday, she'd say, tapping her pencil against the page, this place will look alive again. Jack would just nod. Hope was her department. Survival was his. The storm came on a summer night when the air was too thick, too heavy, charged with an energy that felt like the land itself was holding its breath. Clouds rolled in, bruised and angry, swallowing the moon whole. Thunder cracked across the plains, sharp and loud like artillery fire. Lightning tore the sky into furious, blinding shards. Jack had been dozing in his chair, the old rifle propped near the door, a habit from both the war and a life in the country. The roar of the storm jolted him awake. He rose stiffly. "Damn fences," he muttered, pulling on his worn boots. The wind would find every weakness in those old, warped posts. He knew it. Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, a small ghost in the dim light, her hair mussed from sleep. "Do you need help, Dad?" "No," Jack said, his voice firm. "Stay inside. I won't be long." The rain hit him like a physical blow the moment he stepped outside, soaking his flannel shirt in seconds. He slogged through mud and darkness, the beam of his flashlight cutting a nervous slice through the night. He was halfway along the north fence line when he froze. There it was, a sound that didn't belong to the thunder or the wind. It was a deep, raw, guttural cry carried on the gale, a sound of pure agony. He angled the light toward the ravine that cut along the back of his property. What he saw rooted him to the spot. A horse lay crumpled near the edge of the drop, mud caking its massive body. Its coat was a dark, mottled color, streaked with rain and filth. It was enormous, bigger than any draft horse Jack had ever seen, but it was also skeletal, ribs showing like a cage beneath its hide. One leg was twisted at a sickening, unnatural angle, and blood oozed from a swollen gash. Its sides heaved with labored breaths, each exhale a shudder that shook its entire frame. For a second, Jack's first instinct was to turn away. Nature had already made its decision here. A creature this battered, in a storm this violent, didn't have long. It was the law of the prairie. But then the horse lifted its head, and its eyes caught the light. There was no wild terror in them, no anger, just a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and something else. Something Jack recognized with a jolt that went deeper than the cold rain. It was the hollow gaze of a survivor, the look of someone who had seen too much, endured too much, and was just too tired to fight anymore. His mind flashed back to Afghanistan, to soldiers dragged into makeshift clinics, torn open and gasping. Some had begged him not to let them die. Others had said nothing at all, their eyes screaming louder than their voices ever could. He remembered the crushing weight of the bodies he couldn't save. "No," Jack whispered, his throat tight. "Not tonight." He dropped to his knees in the mud, his military training kicking in, assessing the situation in a heartbeat. The leg wasn't shattered, just a deep, infected wound. The animal had a chance, a slim one, but a chance, if he could move it. He was working before he even realized he'd made the decision. Hauling rope from his belt, fashioning a crude sling, coaxing the horse with low murmurs, even as the rain blinded them both. The creature gave a low, resigned huff, a puff of steamy breath in the cold air, but it didn't fight him. It was as if it understood. With every ounce of strength he had left in his aching body, Jack braced himself and dragged. Inch by agonizing inch, he pulled the massive, dead weight of the horse away from the ravine's edge. It was back-breaking, soul-crushing labor. His scar burned with a white-hot fire. His legs screamed in protest. But he kept going. By the time he finally stumbled into the relative shelter of the barn, soaked to the bone and shaking with exhaustion, the horse collapsed onto the straw-strewn floor with a final shuddering sigh. Emma appeared at the doorway, clutching a flashlight, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Dad." "What is that?" Jack leaned against the stall wall, his chest heaving, struggling to catch his breath. "Trouble," he managed to gasp out. "Get me the first aid kit. And clean rags. Now." The next few hours blurred into a scene of battlefield triage, a dance Jack knew all too well. He boiled water on the small propane stove in the corner, mixing salt into it until it steamed, and carried the bucket into the barn. The horse lay still, its sides still heaving, mud streaking every line of its immense body. Emma held the flashlight, her hands trembling, but she crouched close, her fear overridden by a fierce curiosity. "He's huge," she whispered, her voice full of awe. "Like a monster from a storybook." "He's just hurt," Jack corrected, though as he looked at the sheer size of the animal, he wasn't sure he believed it himself. He knelt, steadying his hands, the same way he used to before stitching up a wound under fire. Carefully, he began to rinse the swollen gash, flushing out the dirt and grime and pus. The horse shuddered, a ripple of pain going through its massive frame, but it didn't kick. It didn't fight. "Hold the light steady," Jack instructed, his voice low and calm. Emma nodded quickly, biting her lip, her focus absolute. Hours ticked by. Jack cleaned, he wrapped, he checked the animal's breathing. And through it all, the horse never once snapped at him, never once tried to throw him off. It only watched him. Its dark, intelligent eyes were fixed on him with an unnerving, profound stillness. At last, Jack sat back on his heels, sweat dripping from his brow despite the cool night air. He exhaled heavily. "That's all I can do tonight." Emma crouched beside him, her gaze fixed on the horse. "Why didn't it fight you, Dad?" Jack shook his head, looking at the creature lying in his barn. "Don't know. Maybe it's too tired. Or maybe—" He trailed off. "Maybe it's just different." The horse shifted slightly, a subtle movement, lowering its head to the straw as if it had heard, and was agreeing. Dawn crept over the Kansas fields, soft grey light slipping through the broken slats of the barn. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that was thick with the smell of damp earth and the first tentative notes of birdsong. Emma sat cross-legged on a bale of straw, her notebook open on her knees. She was sketching quickly, her pencil flying across the page, capturing the powerful curve of the massive neck, the weary but dignified set of the eyes. When Jack entered the barn, she looked up, a smudge of graphite on her cheek. "I gave him a name," she said softly. "Titan." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Titan? He's huge, I'll give you that. But last night he fell like a broken statue." She glanced at the horse, who was still lying quietly, but lifted his head at the sound of her voice. "Titan suits him," she insisted. "He's not broken, he's just resting." Jack studied the creature. Even battered and skeletal, it radiated a kind of presence. You could see the powerful muscles hidden under the skin and bone, the raw potential sleeping just beneath the exhaustion. But it was the eyes that struck him the most. They were haunted, patient, and strangely familiar. He recognized something in that gaze, a deep and unspoken understanding. "I didn't bring him here to ride," Jack muttered at last, more to himself than to her. "Didn't bring him here for anything, but to give him a chance." Emma smiled faintly, a sad, wise smile that didn't belong on a 14-year-old's face. "Sometimes that's enough." For a long, silent moment, the horse and the man regarded each other in the dim morning light. Titan's gaze was steady, almost knowing. Jack felt a strange pull deep in his chest, a jolt of recognition. They were two survivors, cut from the same rough cloth, both scarred, both dismissed by the world, both unwanted. And in the quiet of that broken-down barn, they had found each other. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. The work was endless, but it was a different kind of work now. Jack rose before the sun, his first stop always the barn. The structure was weather-beaten, boards gaping, but it provided enough shelter to keep Titan safe from the elements. Jack kept the stall meticulously clean, spreading fresh straw whenever he could scrounge some, scooping away the muck. Each morning he performed the same ritual. He crouched beside the wounded leg, carefully unwinding the old bandage, rinsing the gash with the salt water he boiled on the kitchen stove. The wound was ugly, inflamed, but slowly, day by day, the raw edges began to knit together. Jack worked with the precision of a field medic, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. And Titan never lashed out, he never even flinched. The horse would simply stand, breathing in long, measured gusts, his body tense but controlled, as if he understood that this strange, painful ritual was what was saving him. Emma became Jack's shadow. She held the lantern when the light was scarce, fetched clean rags, and kept meticulous notes in her sketchbook, documenting every stage of Titan's recovery as if it were a scientific study. She would often whisper encouragements to the big horse, her voice soft as she stroked his neck. "You'll be strong again," she would say. "You're not done yet." Weeks turned into a month. The hollows in Titan's flanks began to fill out. Muscles started to rise in firm ridges beneath his hide. His coat, once dull and caked with mud, began to grow glossy where Emma brushed him down every single day. When he walked, the limp eased and his hooves struck the ground with a surer, heavier weight. But Jack noticed something else too, something strange. The horse was unnervingly attentive. More than once, Jack had tested it without meaning to. A slight shift of his shoulder, a barely perceptible tightening of his grip on the lead rope. Titan responded instantly, almost anticipating the motion before it was fully made. When Jack tapped lightly against the horse's massive shoulder, Titan moved aside without a shred of protest. When he leaned his weight back, Titan stopped dead in his tracks, his dark eyes flicking toward him, waiting for the next direction. One morning, Jack decided to push it further. He led Titan out into the dusty yard, the lead rope slack in his hand. Instead of tugging, he simply walked forward, then angled to the left. The horse followed without hesitation, each heavy, deliberate step matching Jack's stride perfectly. Emma, watching from the porch, gasped audibly, "Dad, he's listening to you. You didn't even pull the rope." Jack frowned, a deep furrow in his brow, but he kept moving, weaving a slow, deliberate pattern across the yard. Titan mirrored him perfectly, his ears pricked, his expression calm and focused. Finally, Jack stopped, facing the horizon. The horse halted instantly, his enormous shadow draping across Jack's shoulder like a silent, loyal sentinel. Jack let out a low whistle, a sound of pure disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned." Emma clapped her hands once, a sharp, joyful sound, her grin wide enough to split her face. "I told you he was special." Jack didn't answer, but deep inside, something stirred. A flicker of a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to have in years. It felt dangerously like hope, but not all hours were filled with sunlight. The nights remained his enemy. The darkness was heavy, haunted. Jack still woke often, his heart racing, his ears ringing with the ghost sounds of Afghanistan. The thud of explosions, the sharp rattle of gunfire, the last calls of his comrades before the silence swallowed them whole. He'd find himself gasping for air in the dark, the walls of the small farmhouse feeling like they were closing in, suffocating him. On those nights, he didn't even try to go back to sleep. He'd pull on his boots and slip out into the cool night air, the silence of the yard a stark contrast to the chaos in his head. And he always ended up at the barn. It was like Titan knew. The horse would be awake, his massive head lifting at the first crunch of Jack's boots on the gravel. His dark eyes would glimmer in the faint moonlight, unafraid, just waiting. Jack would lean against the stall, his body trembling, and reach out a shaking hand. Titan would press forward, his huge head lowering until his warm, steady breath washed against Jack's chest. And slowly Jack's heart would steady. His breathing would even out. He'd slide his palm along the strong, solid curve of the horse's neck, feeling the steady, rhythmic thrum of life beneath the hide. It was grounding. It was a physical reminder that he was here, in Kansas, not there. That the world around him was quiet, not exploding. One night, Emma woke and found her father's bed empty. She padded barefoot through the quiet house and followed the faint glow of a lantern coming from the barn. From the doorway, she watched, unseen. Her father stood with Titan, his forehead resting against the horse's neck. Titan stood like a great dark statue, calm and rooted to the earth, while Jack's shoulders shook with silent, ragged breaths. After a long while, his breathing slowed. The trembling stopped, and in that moment, Emma understood. Titan wasn't just a horse her father had saved, he was saving her father too. She slipped away without a word, returning to her bed with tears in her eyes that she couldn't quite explain. The Saturday market was a sprawling, chaotic tide of life. Canvas tents flapped in the hot Kansas breeze, and the air was thick with a mixture of hay, leather, roasted corn, and horse sweat. Dealers shouted prices over the din, farmers haggled, and kids weaved through the crowd with sticky fingers and wide eyes. Jack Mercer parked his battered GMC at the far end of the lot. The truck coughed and sputtered like an old man clearing his throat before the engine finally died. The rusty trailer attached to it creaked and groaned in protest. Jack climbed down stiffly, his limp more pronounced after the long drive. Emma hopped out on the other side, her sketchbook already tucked under her arm. They were painfully out of place. Jack's jeans were faded and patched at the knee, his boots were scuffed and coated in a permanent layer of dust. Emma wore her usual hand-me-down jacket, the sleeves rolled up twice. The other ranchers looked like they'd stepped straight out of a glossy magazine. Their hats were clean, their shirts were pressed, and their silver belt buckles gleamed in the sun. "Dad," Emma whispered, glancing nervously at the rows of shiny, expensive trailers lined up beside their rust bucket. "Everyone's staring at us." Jack ignored the stares, moving to the back of the trailer. "Let 'em look. He unlatched the door, lowering the ramp with a loud groan of rusted hinges. Inside, Titan shifted, and the whole trailer trembled beneath his weight. Even after weeks of good food and care, the stallion still looked rough. Scars traced faint lines across his hide, and you could still faintly see his ribs. But it was his size that drew the attention. Heads turned as the giant horse stepped down, his hooves thudding against the packed earth. A buzz of voices started immediately. "Lord, look at the size of him. Too big to be any use. Looks half wild to me. Bet he's got a mean streak. That thing doesn't belong here." Emma's cheeks flushed a bright, painful red. She wanted to shout at them, to tell them that Titan was stronger and smarter than any of their polished ponies, that he was different. But she bit her tongue and stayed close to her father. Jack fastened the lead rope, his movements calm and deliberate, and began guiding Titan toward the holding pens at the edge of the market. The air grew thicker with tension as they passed the center ring. A large commotion had gathered near the biggest pen, and Jack caught sight of them. The Canes. Victor Kane was a hard man to miss. He was tall and broad in the shoulders, and his expensive hat was pulled low over eyes as sharp and cold as cut glass. He carried himself with the easy arrogance of a man whose land and money bent the world to his will. At his side stood his son, Logan. He was younger, leaner, with a handsome face that was spoiled by a permanent, condescending smirk. They had brought a horse that looked like it was carved from fire and pride. It was a magnificent chestnut thoroughbred, its coat gleaming in the sun, its mane neatly braided, its muscles rippling as it pranced and danced at the end of its rope. The crowd was leaning in to admire it, their voices rising with awe and envy. Jack would have kept walking, but Victor's gaze found him, locking onto him like a hawk spotting prey. The older man's mouth curved into a slow, humorless smile. "Well now," Victor said, his voice carrying easily over the chatter, "what do we have here?" Logan followed his father's gaze, and then he burst into a laugh that was loud and ugly and turned heads. "You've got to be kidding me." He pointed a manicured finger directly at Titan, who stood calm and still at Jack's side. "That thing looks like it belongs hitched to a logging cart, not standing here among real horses." The crowd chuckled, some of them out of a nervous fear of the Canes, others because ridicule was an easy way to feel superior. Victor let the laughter settle before adding his own poison. "A draft mule dressed up as a stallion. Tell me, Mercer, you planning to pull stumps with that beast, or are you just hoping to sell him for dog feed?" Jack's jaw tightened until a muscle jumped, but he said nothing. His fingers curled around the lead rope, his hand steady. Emma shifted closer to Titan, her face burning with a mixture of shame and fury. Logan stepped forward, his grin widening. "No, no, Dad, don't you see? He's perfect for the classic. A real showpiece. Imagine it. This mountain of a horse tripping over his own feet in Kansas City. People would pay good money just to laugh." Before she could stop herself, Emma snapped, "You don't know anything about him." Logan's grin sharpened, his cold eyes sliding to her. "And you must be Mercer's little girl. Tell me, sweetheart, does he let you climb up on that beast? Or are you afraid it'll topple over and crush you?" Jack's voice cut through the air, low and even and dangerous. "That's enough." Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying the tension. He was a man who fed on the humiliation of others. From his coat pocket, Logan pulled a folded pamphlet. It was crisp and brightly colored, a stark contrast to his own dusty hands. He flicked it open and waved it toward Jack. Bold letters gleamed on the front. "National Horse Classic, Kansas City." "Here," Logan said, thrusting it out. "If you really want the whole world to share in the joke, bring your lumber horse to the Classic. Let them all see what you've scraped out of the mud." His voice was dripping with mockery, but there was a challenge in it too. "Go on, Mercer, make us laugh." The crowd around them erupted again. Some of them clapped Logan on the back, while others just shook their heads in amusement. Whispers rippled through the air. "Mercer won't dare. He knows better. Just look at that wreck of a horse." Jack stood in the center of the storm of noise, his expression unreadable. His hand tightened around the pamphlet as Logan shoved it into his palm. Emma's eyes were burning as she looked up at him. "Dad," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling, "don't let them do this to us." Jack stared down at the paper, at the bold date and the city name. Kansas City. A stage that was too big, too bright, too full of people who would laugh at him. His gut twisted into a knot. The fight inside him was silent but fierce. He had spent years avoiding spotlights, keeping to the shadows where no one could jeer at the broken soldier. He despised being anyone's entertainment, the butt of a wealthy man's joke. The Canes had power, money, and a reputation that could crush him without a second thought. Jack had none of those things. Worse than the humiliation, though, was the fear of failure. The idea of standing in a packed arena, with Emma in the stands watching and seeing Titan stumble, hearing the roar of laughter. It made his chest ache. He could already imagine the look of pity in his daughter's eyes, the crushing humiliation of proving the Canes right. But humiliation wasn't new to him. He had felt it in every sideways glance from potential employers who saw a broken veteran, not a capable man. He felt it in every muttered word about soldiers who were too damaged to function in the real world. He hated it. And standing here, listening to Victor Kane's smug laughter, he hated it more than he had ever hated anything in his life. Behind him, Titan remained perfectly still. The stallion's bulk loomed like a silent mountain, completely unshaken by the ridicule. His ears flicked, but his gaze was calm, fixed on Jack as if he was waiting for orders. In that quiet, steady stare, Jack was thrown back to the battlefield, to the tense, silent moments before the orders came down, when men's lives balanced on choices that no one wanted to make. He clenched his fists. Emma tugged at his sleeve, her voice low but steady. "They only laugh while we're standing still, Dad. Once we start moving, they won't laugh anymore." Her words cut through the noise, through the doubt, through the fear. Jack turned to her and saw the fire in her young eyes, the unshakable belief she had not just in the horse, but in him. He looked back at Titan, at the horse who had stood with him through the storms and the sleepless nights, who had carried his emotional weight not in steps, but in silent, steady companionship. Something inside him shifted. A lock that had been rusted shut for years finally broke. Jack straightened his shoulders, meeting Victor Kane's smug smile head-on. His voice was steady, and it carried farther than he expected. "We'll be there." A hush fell over the crowd for a single heartbeat, then it broke with Victor's sharp, barking laugh. "Well, I'll be damned. The soldier's still got some pride left in him after all." Logan smirked, clapping his hands slowly, mockingly. "Excellent. We'll see you in Kansas City then. I'll make sure we have front-row seats to the greatest comedy act of the year." The Canes turned away, leading their polished thoroughbred through the parting crowd, leaving a wake of whispers and smirks behind them. Emma's hand slid into Jack's, her grip small but fierce. She looked up at him with something in her eyes he hadn't seen in years. It was a pure, undiluted light, not weighed down by grief or poverty. "You said yes," she whispered, almost in awe. Jack exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the pamphlet crumpled in his fist. "I did." He looked past the market stalls, past the dust and the noise, to the long, empty road that led out of town. It stretched into uncertainty, into a spotlight far brighter than he had ever wanted. But Emma's grip tightened, grounding him. And beside him, Titan shifted his weight, steady as a stone, as if he too understood what lay ahead. For the first time in a long, long while, Jack Mercer wasn't turning away from a fight. He was walking toward one. The night after the market felt heavier than most. Jack lay awake long after Emma's breathing had evened out in the next room. The pamphlet from the Canes sat on the kitchen table like a dare, its bold ink and neat folds mocking him in the moonlight. The National Horse Classic, Kansas City. He could still hear Logan's jeering laughter, still see Victor's smug, certain smile. The weight of their challenge was a physical pressure on his chest. Finally, too restless to lie still, he rose and lit the old kerosene lamp. The dim, flickering glow painted long, dancing shadows across the farmhouse walls. He moved to the back storage room, the one that smelled of dust and cedar, where the ghosts of his family's past lingered untouched. In the far corner sat a wooden chest, scarred by time and travel. He knelt before it, brushing away a fine layer of dust from the lid. His fingers hesitated for a moment before lifting it. The hinges groaned in protest, and inside lay fragments of another life. Coils of old rope, a rusted horseshoe, a few photographs that were so faded they were nearly white. And there, resting on a folded wool blanket, was the saddle. It was his father's. The same saddle Jack had watched him strap onto the backs of horses when he was just a boy. The leather was cracked and scuffed, the stitching frayed in places. But the frame was strong, and the rich, comforting smell of old hide and horse sweat still clung to it. Jack reached out and touched it gently, running his hand over the worn seat, tracing the deep marks where stirrups had rubbed against the leather for decades. He closed his eyes, and for a second he was a child again. He saw his father's broad back bent over that very saddle, his calloused hands expertly adjusting the buckles. He remembered the thrill of being lifted onto it, the feeling of being taller, braver, safer, because his father was there, his strong hand steadying him. Now, years later, the saddle felt less like an artifact and more like a question. Could he carry the weight of that legacy? Could he step into a ring where the entire world expected him to fail, with nothing but this battered old saddle and a horse he'd pulled from the edge of death? He exhaled slowly, setting the lamp down beside him. "Guess it's you and me again, old man," he murmured to the empty room. His hand lingered on the worn leather, his eyes distant and wet with a memory that was both a comfort and a burden. The following morning, Emma found him in the barn. The old saddle was draped over the stall wall. She blinked in surprise, then a slow, hopeful smile spread across her face. "You brought it out." Jack nodded, holding a soft cloth and a tin of saddle oil. "Needs some work." She joined him immediately, her small hands eager to help. Together they worked in comfortable silence, rubbing the conditioning oil deep into the dry leather, coaxing back a faint, rich sheen. Emma hummed softly under her breath, her strokes careful and precise. Titan stood nearby, his massive head turned toward them. His ears flicked at every squeak of the leather, at every quiet word that passed between the father and daughter. He shifted his weight once, the ground vibrating faintly beneath his hooves, but he didn't move away. He just watched them, steady and intent, like a soldier listening to orders being given. Emma glanced up at him, a grin tugging at her lips. "I swear he knows what we're doing. Look at those eyes. He understands more than we think." Jack shook his head, but the corners of his mouth tugged upward into a reluctant smile. "He's a horse, Emma." "Maybe," she said, her cloth brushing along a worn stirrup. "But maybe he's more than that." Jack didn't argue. He couldn't. The way Titan's gaze lingered on him was too long, too focused for him to dismiss it so easily. Their training began quietly, almost cautiously. Jack approached it the way he had once approached new recruits in the army. Patience first, then discipline, and finally mastery. He set no grand, impossible goals. Instead, he started building a foundation, brick by slow, careful brick. He started with simple groundwork. A slight shift of his shoulder was a signal for Titan to move aside. A step backward from Jack meant Titan should yield. When Jack leaned forward, Titan advanced, his heavy steps deliberate but instantly responsive. There was no cracking whip, no harsh yanking of a rope. There was only the steady, quiet rhythm of trust and repetition. Emma watched every single session, her notebook open on her knees. She sketched diagrams of their movements, scribbled notes about what worked and what didn't. Sometimes she'd call out words of encouragement. Other times she'd rush forward with a brush or a soft rag to soothe Titan's old scars when they seemed to tighten. The stallion learned quickly. Too quickly, Jack sometimes thought. He absorbed commands with an uncanny sharpness, as if he had been waiting his whole life for someone to speak his language. One evening, as Jack was working on refining Titan's gait, Emma whispered, "He's not like the other horses, Dad. He's tuned into you. It's like he can hear what you're not even saying." Jack didn't answer, but deep inside he felt a jolt of recognition. On patrols in Afghanistan, he'd learned to read the subtle signs of the men around him. A glance, a held breath, a slight tension in the shoulders. It was a silent language, and it was how soldiers kept each other alive. Titan was responding in the same way, attuned to things that were left unsaid. The training brought back other memories too. He remembered crouching in the dust, his hands covered in blood, a young soldier gasping for breath beneath him. He'd whispered calm, steady words to the boy, even as bullets cracked overhead, even as explosions rattled the very ground they lay on. The boy had lived because Jack had been steady, because discipline and patience had guided his hands instead of panic. Now, in the Kansas dirt, he used that same calm voice, the same unhurried hands. Titan moved because Jack asked him to, not because Jack forced him to. And in that quiet, respectful rhythm, Jack found echoes of the battlefield. But for the first time, the echo was giving life instead of taking it away. The days blurred together into a routine of sweat and dust. Sweat darkened Jack's shirt, and dust clung to Titan's powerful legs. Emma's sketchbook filled page after page, and slowly the impossible began to look natural. The horse that had once collapsed, broken in a storm, now sidestepped at the gentle brush of a knee. He could spin in a tight, controlled circle at the subtle tilt of a shoulder. One late afternoon, as the horizon burned gold, Jack wiped the sweat from his brow. It was time. He led Titan into the open yard, Emma watching with wide, expectant eyes. "Let's try something harder," he murmured. He gave the signal, a subtle lean, a slight lift of his hand. Titan responded instantly, turning in a tight, graceful spiral, his massive body pivoting with a dancer's elegance. Dust rose in swirling clouds around them, then Jack stopped sharply, and Titan halted within a breath, towering over him but perfectly aligned, perfectly still. For a second, a profound silence hung in the air. Then Emma squealed, a sound of pure joy, clapping her hands so hard she nearly dropped her notebook. "He did it, Dad! He actually did it!" She ran forward and flung her arms around him. Jack froze for a second, then awkwardly patted her back, his weathered face breaking into something rare and precious. An unguarded smile, his eyes, usually dulled by exhaustion and old pain, glimmered with something that had long been dormant. Titan blew out a deep, snorting breath, almost smugly, his ears flicking forward as if he was fully aware of his own accomplishment. Jack stroked his thick neck, his voice rough but steady. "Looks like you're ready after all, big fella." A week later, a stranger arrived. Jack had arranged for a vet to check Titan's health before he would even consider the long trip to Kansas City. He was expecting an older, gruff country vet. Instead, a young man stepped out of a clean pickup truck. He was tall, lean, with sharp, intelligent eyes that were softened by a genuine kindness. "Ryan Holt," he introduced himself, shaking Jack's hand firmly. "My father served with you years back. Daniel Holt." Jack blinked, the name hitting him like a physical blow. "Holt? You're Daniel Holt's boy." Ryan nodded. "That's right. He always said you were the one who patched him up when his Humvee went down." Jack grunted, the memories flooding back, unbidden. "Your dad was tougher than he looked." They walked to the barn, Emma hovering curiously behind them. Titan stood inside, massive and calm, his ears flicking as the stranger approached. Ryan's eyes widened as he took in the horse. "Good Lord," he breathed, "I've never seen one like this." He circled the stallion slowly, observing his build, the clean, powerful lines of his legs, the incredible depth of his chest. Titan tolerated the inspection, but his gaze remained fixed on Jack, as if asking if this newcomer was friend or foe. Ryan crouched, examining the healed wound on Titan's leg. Clean work. Whoever tended to this knew what they were doing. Jack just shrugged. "I did what I could." Ryan straightened, his expression thoughtful. "You do realize what you've got here, don't you, Mr. Mercer? This isn't just any horse. The muscle distribution, the stride, the very way he holds himself. He looks like an iron stride." Jack frowned. "Never heard of it." "It's a legendary line of giants," Ryan explained, a flicker of excitement in his voice. "Bred decades ago. They were used by the military. They were supposed to be extinct, wiped out by a storm years ago. But this one—" He glanced at Titan, pure awe in his eyes. "This one might be the last of them." Emma gasped softly, her pencil nearly slipping from her hand. "So, he really is special." Ryan nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horse. "Special doesn't even begin to cover it." Jack looked at Titan, who just flicked an ear as if he was completely unimpressed by the revelation of his own legendary status. But deep inside, Jack felt the truth of the vet's words settle like a stone in his chest. This horse wasn't just a second chance. He was a legacy, a ghost from the past, and Jack was about to ride him into a war he never saw coming. The morning of their departure came with a pale, streaky sky, the kind that promised blistering heat by noon. Jack Mercer stood beside his battered GMC, his breath misting in the faint dawn chill. He gave the straps securing the old trailer one last tug, testing the rusted buckles and frayed ropes. They creaked, but they held. The truck was a relic, its paint sun-bleached, patches of rust eating into its frame like a disease. When Jack twisted the key, the engine shuddered to life with a protesting growl that rattled through the quiet yard. Titan waited near the ramp, his massive head lowered. Jack led him forward, his voice a low murmur. "Easy, big fella. Just a ride. You've carried worse weight than this." The stallion obeyed, stepping into the narrow space with a surprising calm. His hooves thudded on the wooden floor, shaking the thin metal walls. The trailer was too small for such a giant, forcing him to lower his head. His breath came in slow, steady gusts, his eyes watchful but trusting. Emma stood at the farmhouse door, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. She scribbled a few quick lines, capturing the silhouette of the horse and the ramp against the rising sun, then tucked the pencil away. Her eyes flicked to Jack. "Ready?" Jack slammed the rusty trailer door shut, the sound echoing in the still morning air. He nodded once. "Ready as we'll ever be." They climbed into the truck's cab. The sun was just edging over the horizon, throwing long skeletal shadows ahead of them as the GMC groaned and lurched onto the open road. The miles unspooled slowly, the landscape a monotonous stretch of muted browns and greys. The radio hummed with static, occasionally catching the thin, weary voice of a country singer from some distant station. Jack kept one eye on the rearview mirror, where he could just glimpse the sway of the trailer. Titan shifted occasionally, the faint flick of his dark mane catching in the glass. Emma sat with her knees pulled up to her chest, trying to draw despite the truck's constant rattling. Her pencil scratched out uneven, jerky lines. She glanced up when a harsh cry split the air outside. A flock of black crows lifted from a nearby field, their wings slicing through the sky. They circled once, high overhead, before streaking eastward, their calls echoing like a dire warning. Emma shivered. "That's not a good sign, is it?" Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't look at her. "They're just birds." But his jaw was clenched, and Emma didn't miss it. The fields rolled by in a blur of silence and dry grass. In the distance, skeletal windmills stood with their arms stilled, rusted from years of disuse. The very earth seemed tired, beaten down, much like the truck that rattled and groaned over every bump and crack in the asphalt. By midday, the sky was a burning, hazy white. Heat shimmered off the road, distorting the horizon into a watery mirage. Sweat beaded on Jack's brow. The truck's temperature gauge was climbing steadily, the needle creeping into the red. He pressed his lips into a thin, hard line, willing it to go back down. Then the engine coughed. Once, twice, then a sharp, violent hiss. A thick plume of black smoke coiled out from under the hood. "Damn it!" Jack swore, yanking the wheel hard to the right, pulling the truck onto the dusty shoulder. The GMC shuddered to a halt, jerking once before a dead silence claimed the cab. Emma stared at the smoke curling into the sky. "Dad?" He shoved the door open and limped to the front of the truck. When he lifted the hood, a blast of scorching heat hit him in the face. Oil hissed and popped on the hot engine block, dripping onto the dirt below. The acrid smell of burning metal filled the air. In the trailer, Titan began to stamp his hooves, the sound of iron on wood clanging like an alarm bell. The sound was sharp, frantic. Jack rushed to the side door, flinging it open. The inside of the trailer was an oven. The metal walls radiated heat, trapping the stale air. Titan's hide was slick with sweat. His nostrils flared wide as he sucked in thin, desperate breaths. He pawed at the floor, his eyes wide with panic. Emma's voice broke. "Dad, he can't breathe in there." Jack tried to coax some cooler air inside, swinging the door wide, but the breeze was barely a whisper. The stallion's chest heaved, his powerful muscles straining with each ragged gulp of air. Jack pressed his palm against the horse's massive neck, feeling the fevered, frantic pulse beneath the skin. "Hold on, boy, just hold on," he murmured, but a cold fear was clawing at his gut. He scanned the endless stretch of highway. Nothing. Nothing but dust, heat, and empty land. No cars, no help in sight. For the first time since he had dragged Titan from that storm-ravaged ravine, Jack felt completely, utterly helpless. The sound came first, a deep, powerful hum, the growl of engines that weren't strained, but purring with power. Jack turned, shielding his eyes against the blinding glare. Over the rise in the road, a convoy appeared. Gleaming SUVs, horse trailers polished to a mirror shine, chrome glinted, paint sparkled. It was wealth on wheels. Emma's face went pale. It's them. The Kane convoy rolled closer, slowing as it approached the site of the smoking, stranded GMC. Logan Kane's sleek pickup truck was in the lead. He leaned an elbow out the window, a wide, smug grin spreading across his face when he spotted Jack. "Well, well," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension over the roar of their engines. "Looks like the soldiers' cavalry gave out on him." Behind him, the largest of the trailers gleamed, its air vents wide and humming with the faint sound of powerful cooling fans. The difference between their setup and Jack's was the difference between night and day. Luxury against ruin. Victor Kane sat in the back seat of the lead SUV, his face hidden behind a pair of expensive sunglasses, his expression unreadable. He didn't signal for the convoy to stop, but another vehicle braked sharply. Ryan Holt swung his door open before the tires had even finished crunching to a halt on the gravel. He jogged toward Jack, his expression tight with concern. "Jack, what happened?" "Engines blown," Jack answered shortly. His shirt was clinging to his back with sweat. "It's cooking him alive in there." Ryan peered into the trailer, and his face blanched at the sight of Titan's heaving sides. "We have to move him. Now." From the SUV, Victor's voice cut through the air, sharp and impatient. "We don't have time for this, Ryan. Leave him. We've got a schedule to keep." Ryan turned, a flash of pure fury in his eyes. "If we keep driving, he'll be dead before the hour's out. You want that blood on your hands?" Victor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. A tense silence stretched out over the highway. "Please," Emma burst out, her voice shaking. She clutched her sketchbook to her chest like a shield. "He's not just any horse. He's ours." Ryan looked back at Victor, his voice low but resolute. "We stop or I walk." Finally, with a curt, angry gesture, Victor signaled. The convoy slowed to a halt along the shoulder of the road. Jack's throat burned with a bitter mixture of pride and humiliation as he gave Ryan a single grateful nod. "All right, let's do it." The trailer door groaned open wider. Titan lurched forward, steam rising off his back like mist in the hot air. Jack braced himself, stroking the horse's thick neck. "Come on, boy, just a little farther." Ryan led the way toward the Kane's main trailer. The contrast was jarring: sleek white panels, polished steel, and air vents spilling cool drafts of air. Inside, fans whirred softly. It was a haven against the blistering day. Titan stepped up the ramp, his hooves clanging on the metal, and disappeared into the cooler space. His breathing eased almost instantly, the frantic, ragged edge softening. He lowered his head, exhaling in a long, shuddering rush of relief. Jack followed him in, resting his forehead against Titan's damp shoulder. Relief warred with a deep, burning shame. Behind them, Logan was leaning lazily against his truck, his arms crossed. He smirked, his voice dripping with mockery. "Well, at least the lumber horse gets a taste of class before he makes a fool of himself. Hope he doesn't scratch the paint." Emma's hands curled into tight fists. She wanted to scream at him, but Jack's silence stopped her. He only straightened up slowly, his gaze as hard as granite. "Thank you," he said to Ryan, and the words cost him more than Logan would ever know. Ryan just nodded, his eyes showing that he understood more than Jack wanted him to. Jack stepped back down from the luxurious trailer, his shoulders heavy. He could still hear Logan's mocking laughter in his ears. For Jack Mercer, the road to Kansas City had just begun, and it was already paved with pride he'd been forced to swallow like bitter medicine. The city rose on the horizon like a mirage, a shimmering collection of glass and steel after endless miles of dust and dying farmland. Kansas City. For Jack Mercer, who had lived most of his life under wide-open skies, the sight felt alien and hostile. The truck's battered engine, patched up enough to limp the rest of the way, coughed as if protesting its intrusion into such a polished, unforgiving place. Emma pressed her nose against the window, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "Look at all the lights, Dad. It's huge." Jack kept both hands steady on the wheel, his gaze flicking to the towering banners that soon came into view. Bold letters stretched across them, billowing in the city breeze, "National Horse Classic." The name loomed like a verdict waiting to be delivered. The closer they got, the thicker the traffic became. Horse trailers gleamed white and silver, polished until they reflected the world around them. Trucks purred with powerful engines built for prestige and endurance. Men in tailored jackets and women in bright, fashionable hats leaned casually out of their windows, their easy laughter drifting across the lanes. The horses inside the open-air trailers gleamed just as brightly as the machines that carried them. Their sleek, muscled coats brushed to a mirror shine. Jack's rust-bitten GMC clattered among them like a relic from another era. Other drivers leaned from their windows to stare, their eyebrows raised at the stark contrast. The old trailer rattled and groaned, its sides patched with mismatched boards, its paint streaked with the dust of the long road. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clutching her sketchbook tighter. "We don't belong here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the truck's rattling engine. Jack didn't answer, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles were white. The Kansas City Horse Complex sprawled across several acres, a gleaming monument to wealth and tradition. Arched gates stretched high, bearing the event's insignia. Crowds swarmed at the entrances, dressed in neat shirts, crisp dresses, and brand-new cowboy hats that looked like they'd been bought for the occasion rather than earned through years of hard work. The GMC lurched past the gates under the watchful eyes of staff in crisp, clean uniforms. They directed Jack toward the far end of the stables, while the other, wealthier competitors turned into rows lined with banners and overflowing flower pots. Jack was waved onward, further and further, until the manicured walkways gave way to shadowed, forgotten corners. "Stall 29, the attendant called out, a clipboard in his hand. He didn't even look up as he checked a box beside Jack's name. "End of the row." Jack drove on until the glamour completely faded. The stalls here were narrow and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew. The wood sagged in places, the paint was peeling, and the straw on the ground was thin and musty. Emma wrinkled her nose as she hopped down from the cab. This can't be right. But it was. The brass plate nailed crookedly above the very last stall bore the number 29. Jack lowered the trailer ramp. Titan stepped heavily onto the asphalt, his nostrils flaring at the scent of 100 other horses nearby. He dwarfed the narrow aisle as Jack led him toward the stall. Where the other horses had wide, airy spaces filled with golden straw and polished brass water buckets, stall 29 waited like a punishment cell. Titan had to duck his massive head to enter. His dark mane brushed against the warped wooden beams of the low ceiling. Light barely filtered through the crooked slats, painting stripes of shadow across his broad back. He shifted his weight, testing the cramped space, then settled onto the thin layer of straw without protest. Emma swallowed hard. Quietly, she spread a worn blanket she had brought from home over the thin bedding, smoothing it with her hands as if the small gesture could somehow disguise the squalor. She looked up at her father, her eyes accusing. "They stuck us here on purpose." Jack didn't have to answer. His grim silence said enough. The difference between them and the others was impossible to ignore. Ranch hands strutted by, leading glistening thoroughbreds with bridles that gleamed with silver buckles. Their stalls were lined with fresh, fragrant straw. Their feed bins were full of premium grain, and their names were etched on proud, polished plaques above their doors. Royal Comet, Golden Prize, Starlight Sonata. As Titan settled into the gloom, passers-by slowed down to stare. Whispers rose in their wake. "What in the hell is that thing?" one man muttered, tugging at the reins of his bay mare. "Looks like a draft horse they dragged out of a lumber mill." Another man snorted, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Looks like someone dragged the freak show into the classic this year." Laughter followed, quick and sharp and cruel. Emma's cheeks burned. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, afraid that if she looked up, the tears that were prickling her lashes would spill over. Titan, however, seemed completely unconcerned. He tore at a mouthful of the musty hay, chewing with a steady, indifferent rhythm, as though the voices around him were nothing more than the buzzing of flies. Jack leaned against the stall door, his eyes half-lidded. His outward calm was a mask. His hand was clenching the wood of the door so tightly that his knuckles ached. The laughter swelled again as a familiar, hated voice cut through the den. "Well, well, if it isn't the Mercers." Victor Kane strode down the aisle as if he owned the entire complex, his polished boots clicking smartly against the concrete. He wore a tailored vest under his jacket, a silk tie knotted precisely at his throat. Behind him, Logan sauntered, that permanent smirk already in place. They stopped directly in front of stall 29. Victor took one long, dismissive glance at Titan before throwing his head back and letting out a booming laugh. Good God above! They really let a draft mule in among the princes. Logan leaned against the doorframe, his eyes flicking up and down the stallion. "Tomorrow's entertainment is sorted," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've got front-row seats to the biggest joke in the history of the classic." His words carried. Phones were lifted, cameras clicked. The promise of viral mockery was already buzzing in the air. Emma stiffened, her small hand trembling as it slid into her father's. She whispered urgently, "Don't let them take this from us, Dad. Please." Jack stood tall, but he said nothing. His face remained carved from stone. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his palm on Titan's neck. The stallion lifted his head, his ears flicking back at the sound of the laughter, but his body remained calm and steady under Jack's touch. The gesture wasn't defiance, not exactly, but it was something steady, unmovable. Victor's grin faltered for just a fraction of a second. He tipped his hat mockingly before turning on his heel. Logan laughed as he followed, tossing over his shoulder, "See you in the ring, soldier." A heavy, stifling silence followed in their wake. Emma's nails dug into Jack's hand, but when she looked up at him, she didn't see defeat in his eyes. His jaw was set like iron, his gaze fixed firmly on the magnificent stallion before them. Jack bent slightly, murmuring low so only Titan could hear. "We hold steady, that's all we do." Titan turned his head, brushing his soft muzzle against Jack's shoulder as if in answer. Emma drew a shaky breath. The humiliation still burned, but for the first time since they had arrived, she felt a flicker of a different kind of heat. It wasn't shame, it was fire. Jack straightened, his eyes hard with resolve. Let them laugh now. He glanced down at his daughter, his voice steady and low. "Tomorrow they'll see." Titan shifted in the stall, a low rumble coming from deep in his chest, as though he was agreeing. And in that dim, forgotten corner of the horse complex, where dust and disdain mingled in the air, something fierce and unbreakable was being forged. The night pressed down, heavy and suffocating after a long day of humiliation. Jack had parked the battered GMC near the far edge of their assigned barn, the long shadows of the complex stretching across the dirt. From the truck's cab, he and Emma could see the distant, festive glow of the main arena, where music drifted faintly on the night air. The gala lights glittered like a different, more welcoming world. Out here, their corner of the grounds was dim and forgotten. Emma was curled under a thin blanket in the passenger seat, her sketchbook still open on her lap, though her pencil had long since fallen from her slack fingers. She was asleep. Jack sat upright behind the wheel, the old seat creaking beneath him as he shifted, listening to the silence. Beyond the dusty windshield, their barn loomed, dark and weathered. A faint draft whispered through the gaps in its wood, carrying the sharp, damp smell of old straw and mildew. Now and then, the soft snort of Titan carried across the distance, deep, even breaths that reassured Jack. The big horse was lying down, resting. For a moment, everything was still. Everything was steady. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He closed his eyes, telling himself to take whatever sleep he could get. It was the crash that woke him, a violent pounding sound of hooves striking wood, hard and frantic. Jack's eyes snapped open. For a disoriented second, he was back in Afghanistan, the ground shaking from incoming mortar rounds. Then Emma bolted upright beside him, her eyes wide with terror. "Dad, what is it?" He was already out the door. Gravel crunched under his boots as he sprinted toward the barn, Emma right at his heels, the flashlight clutched in both of her shaking hands. Inside stall 29, chaos reigned. Titan was rearing up against the door, his enormous head tossing, his eyes wide and white in the half-darkness. He struck the boards with desperate, powerful kicks, the thunder of his iron shoes against the wood rattling down the entire aisle. Foam flecked his lips, and his muzzle was wet and grotesquely swollen. Emma gasped, her voice breaking. "Dad, what's happening to him?" Jack caught her shoulder and pulled her back, his own pulse hammering, but his movements were steady, controlled. He ducked into the stall, his hands up, his voice low and sharp. "Easy, boy, easy." Titan whipped his head around, coughing against a pressure in his throat. His breath was coming in short, jagged rasps, as if the very air had turned to poison. Jack's eyes scanned the stall and saw the feed trough overturned, hay scattered across the floor, and then the smell hit him. It was sharp, acrid, unnatural. He crouched, scooping up a handful of the hay. The strands were damp and clumped together, dusted with a fine powder that stung his nose. A bitter chemical reek clawed at his throat, burning his lungs until he gagged. He spat to the side, his eyes watering. "This isn't rot," he muttered, his voice low and shaking with a cold, rising fury. "This was done on purpose." He flung the hay out of the stall door, shaking his hand to get the residue off. The anger in him rising, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. Emma's eyes filled with panic. Somebody poisoned him. Jack didn't have to answer. His grim silence confirmed her worst fear. But there was no time to rage. He grabbed the plastic water bucket from the corner and hurried to the spigot at the end of the aisle, filling it as fast as he could, the water slapping hard against the sides. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of his past life. Battlefield reflexes, precise, efficient, unshaken. He mixed coarse salt into the water, stirring it with his arm, then rushed back to Titan. The stallion's eyes were rolling, the whites flashing in the dim light. He struck once more at the wall, then shuddered, his whole body trembling under its own weight. Jack pressed a hand to the horse's cheek. "Steady, soldier, I've got you." With his other hand, he soaked an old rag in the salt water, then pushed it gently between Titan's teeth, wiping away the foam and spit. Titan jerked his head violently at first, nearly throwing Jack off balance. But Jack held firm, murmuring to him, his voice steady and low, the same voice he had once used on bleeding men on a dusty floor halfway around the world. Emma held the flashlight high, her hands shaking so badly the beam jumped and danced across the walls. "What do I do?" she begged, her voice a thin, terrified whisper. "Here," Jack said, thrusting the light back into her grip and guiding her closer. "Hold him. Right here at his pole. Steady pressure." She nodded, swallowing her fear. Her small fingers dug into Titan's coarse mane, and she held on as best she could. Her knees were trembling, but she didn't let go. Jack worked with a methodical calm, rinsing the horse's mouth, wiping, rinsing again. His shirt was soon soaked with sweat and salt water, his hands raw. He whispered the whole time, nonsense words, gentle phrases, the rhythm of his voice more important than the meaning. Slowly, slowly, Titan's wild thrashing began to ebb. His powerful muscles still quivered, and sweat darkened his hide, but his breaths began to lengthen, to deepen. For Jack, the barn had become another war zone. A soldier was down, a medic was working by dim light, an assistant, small and terrified, but unwavering, was holding the line. And just like those long, dark nights years ago, survival depended on not faltering, not giving in to the panic. A slash of light cut across the aisle. Another flashlight, bouncing fast as its owner ran toward them. "Mercer!" Ryan Holt's voice rang out, urgent. He skidded into view, his hair disheveled, a stethoscope swinging from his neck. "I heard the commotion." "What?" He stopped short, his eyes taking in the scene. Titan, sweating and trembling. Jack, kneeling in the muck. Emma, pale with strain, her knuckles white as she clung to the horse. Jack wasted no words. He jerked his chin toward the scattered hay outside the stall. Ryan crouched, sniffed it, and recoiled instantly. "Goddamn!" His expression hardened into a mask of cold fury. "Capsaicin compound." They use this stuff to keep vermin out of feed bins, but only in trace doses. This. He shook his head, his voice tight with anger. This is sabotage. Someone wanted him out of the competition. Maybe even dead. Emma choked back a sob. But why? Ryan's eyes flicked once in the direction of the Kane's luxurious trailers, then back to Jack. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he moved fast, pulling a syringe from the medical bag at his side. Keep him steady. Jack braced Titan's head. Emma pressed the flashlight beam to the spot on the horse's neck that Ryan indicated. With a practiced ease, the vet slipped the needle in. Titan flinched, but he held. Ryan depressed the plunger, his movements sharp and efficient. Minutes stretched out, feeling like hours. Titan's breathing slowed even more, the ragged hitch in his chest fading. The foam stopped bubbling at his lips. His massive head lowered, his eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. Ryan pressed his stethoscope to the stallion's chest, his lips moving as he counted under his breath. When he finally pulled it away, he let out a long, slow sigh of relief. He'll live. He's tough as nails. But this, he shook his head again, this was no accident. Jack leaned back on his heels, his own chest heaving, though he hadn't been the one fighting for breath. His eyes cut to the ruined hay, scattered like a confession across the dirt. The rage in him wasn't hot anymore, it was ice, sharp and absolute. He stood, his shoulders squared, and reached for an empty burlap sack that was leaning against the wall. With slow, deliberate care, he began to shovel the tainted hay into it. The chemical stench burned his nostrils, but he did not flinch. He tied the mouth of the sack in a hard, tight knot. When he straightened up, his voice was quiet, but it was as hard as iron. This doesn't get thrown out. This stays. We'll need the proof. Emma, still clutching the flashlight, stared at him. For the first time, she wasn't just seeing her father. She was seeing the soldier he had once been. His eyes were glacial, his expression carved from stone. It frightened her, but it also steadied her. Ryan watched him silently, then nodded. Keep it locked up. Tomorrow, you're going to want witnesses. Jack set the sack in the corner of the stall, his hand lingering on the rough fabric. His jaw worked once before he spoke again. They won't get away with this. The barn settled into a tense quiet. Titan shifted, resting his weight more easily now, his sides rising and falling with slow, deep breaths. Emma leaned against him, pressing her face into his sweat-damp coat, whispering, "We've got you. You're safe now." Jack looked at them both, his daughter and the great black horse. The night had been meant to break them. Instead, it had carved something harder, something sharper into their souls. The storm was still coming. But now Jack knew exactly where it was going to land. Morning rose bright and brazen, all brass bands and fluttering banners. The National Horse Classic woke like a carnival. Flags snapped against a cloudless sky, speakers thumped with cheerful announcements, and vendors hawked overpriced coffee and sugared dough. By 9 a.m., the grandstands were a shimmering quilt of bodies, a sea of hats and sunglasses glinting under the flood of light. The main ring was a perfect oval of raked sand, its white rails gleaming, its banners shouting the names of corporate sponsors to the sun. Jack walked with Emma to the inn gate, Titan's hoofbeats a slow, deliberate drum on the packed sand behind them. The air was sharp with the smell of leather polish and adrenaline. One act finished just as they arrived. A gleaming bay horse floated across the arena, its rider immaculate in a white vest and crisp breeches. The crowd clapped in perfect, polite unison. An announcer with a smooth, radio-perfect voice purred compliments, listing the horse's bloodlines like a roster of saints. In the rows above, a knot of spectators leaned together, murmuring, "What's that old man brought in?" Someone snorted, "A draft horse, Lord help him." Another voice chuckled, "That giant's going to trip on the first turn." Phones rose like periscopes, faces tilted to get a good look at the coming punchline. On the VIP platform, Victor Kane lounged in his chair as if it were a throne. Logan sat beside him, one ankle hooked over his knee, sipping something cold through a straw. When he spotted Jack at the gate, he smiled a smile as thin and sharp as a blade. "Showtime," he murmured to his father. Emma hugged her sketchbook to her chest, pressing her shoulder against Jack's arm as if to shore him up against the weight of 1,000 mocking stares. "They don't know, Titan," she whispered up at the horse. "Not yet." Jack nodded without looking at her. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the center of the arena, measuring distances the way a soldier measures alleys and rooftops. He rested one palm on Titan's neck. The stallion's skin shivered beneath his hand, not with fear, but with a coiled, ready energy. The steward nodded them forward. They stepped into the light, and the laughter met them. First, a scattered chuckle, then a rolling wave. The sheer scale of Titan in that clean, perfect bowl of an arena was shocking. He was a mountain among deer. The faint scars traced his leg like old rivers. His mane wasn't braided into a neat pattern, his tail wasn't tied with a ribbon. He was raw, immense, both less and more than anything the audience had expected. "Where's the circus?" a man called out, and someone whistled a cartoonish tune. "The elephant got lost," another one chimed in. The sound bounced off the metal grandstands and the smiling faces, a rolling wave of amusement that was eager to be cruel. Jack didn't flinch. He walked Titan straight into the center of the ring. The lead rope was slack. The old battered saddle sat on the horse's back, its worn leather as quiet as a held breath. He set his hand against the stallion's warm neck and felt the powerful pulse there, slow and present. Emma watched from the rail, a tightness in her throat that tasted like last night's salt and fear. She told herself not to think of the poisoned hay, not to think of Titan's frantic, gasping breaths. She clung to the truth she saw in the horse's steady, intelligent eyes. Now the music swelled, a slow, mournful country melody, a single guitar line fanning out over the ring like wind over a wheat field. Jack exhaled. He shifted his weight, an almost invisible lean of his hip and shoulder, and Titan moved sideways. The change in the crowd was a soft, collective intake of breath. Not yet belief, but surprise. The stallion's massive body flowed laterally across the sand, each cross-step clean, precise, his hooves whispering in a measured, perfect rhythm. His neck was arched, his ears pricked toward Jack, his attention fixed on the man like a compass needle pointing north. The laughter thinned, then died completely. Jack raised the ask, a gentle press of his knee, a light, almost imperceptible pulse through the line. Titan coiled and then spun in a tight circle that should have been physically impossible for a horse of his size. His hindquarters anchored him as his forelegs crossed like a dancer's, like brush strokes on a canvas. Dust lifted in a soft halo around them. The stallion's tail flicked once, perfectly in time with the music. Not a swat at a fly, but a punctuation mark. Someone in the front row lowered their phone. Another spectator leaned forward, shading his eyes. A woman's mouth fell open into a surprised "Oh!" Emma's grin split her face. She started scratching lines across the paper in her sketchbook without even looking down, her hand moving automatically, catching the angles and arcs, the tilt of Titan's head toward Jack's shoulder. The way the old saddle sat on his back, not like a relic, but like a crown that had been returned to its rightful brow. Jack felt the pulse of the arena change. He felt the way the sound drew inward, concentrating. He could hear Titan's breathing. He could hear his own. He could hear, absurdly, the tiny distinct click of a camera lens focusing from the far rail. He waited for the moment when the audience's attention wasn't just a light on his skin, but a physical weight in the air. And then he did the thing that made Emma's heart stop. He dropped the lead rope. It fell to the sand like a severed line. A hiss of voices rose from the crowd, a reflex of both panic and glee. "He's insane," someone whispered. "Now watch him bolt," another said with relish. In the VIP box, Logan leaned forward, his hands braced on his knees, a hungry, predatory look in his eyes. Jack didn't move toward the rope. He didn't reach for it. He just breathed. He turned his shoulders a fraction of an inch and let his left knee speak a silent command. Titan answered. No rope, no bit, no visible tie to hold him. And yet the stallion sighed past again, as smooth as water sliding across a flat stone. His head dipped in time with the guitar's melody, as if he could feel the measure of the music the same way Jack did. Jack's calf brushed lightly against his side. Titan curved around him in a soft, graceful arc, then another, shifting his immense weight with a ballet dancer's balance. A child's voice rose from the stands, clear as a bell. "Mommy, he's dancing." Cameras leaned over the rail like a field of sunflowers chasing the light. The announcer had forgotten to breathe. Emma's hand flew to her mouth, then dropped again because she refused to hide her smile. Jack raised the difficulty. He planted his own feet, his shoulders square, and asked with almost nothing. A half-held breath, a thought sent down his spine. Titan lifted a foreleg high, a powerful, controlled rise, then set it down with the delicate care of a man placing a priceless antique. The stallion's neck rounded, his ears never leaving Jack. No one was laughing anymore. The silence was so profound, it made the music feel bigger, more important. Jack exhaled. "Good," he murmured. It was a word Titan didn't need to hear, but one that Jack did. He pivoted, and Titan turned with him, so close that the stallion's warm breath ghosted across Jack's sleeve. They stopped together, perfectly aligned, like two compass points touching, becoming one. For a heartbeat, nothing moved, and then the arena broke. The applause came in a sudden, violent rush, a rising wall of sound that turned into stomping feet and clapping hands and whistles. People surged to their feet. A man who had jeered just minutes before was now slapping his palm red, shouting wordlessly. A woman was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, laughing at herself even as the tears fell. "Not a logging horse," she whispered to her neighbor, "a warrior." On the platform, Victor Kane's smug smile curdled and slid off his face. Logan stared at the empty lead rope lying on the sand as if it had personally betrayed him. Emma was crying openly now, the kind of tears that come from a pressure releasing, not from a heartbreaking. "I knew it," she said to no one at all. "I knew you were more." Jack put a hand to his heart and bowed, not grandly, just a simple, honest gesture of respect to the crowd. And Titan dipped his head too. It was a perfect mirror image, a gesture so unexpected and so profound that the big screen caught it and froze it for a breath. Man and horse, suspended in a single powerful silhouette. A cheer rolled around the stadium like thunder. For that one moment, the whisper that had followed Jack Mercer everywhere, poor, broken, a joke, was drowned out by a truth that was visible even to those who had refused to see it. The giant in the ring wasn't an accident of muscle and bone, he was a statement. And the man at his side wasn't a relic from a forgotten war. They were one. The ovation was still trembling in the rafters when the head judge stood up. Alan Reeves was a man known for his cool precision and a memory like an archive, not for theatrics. But he rose so abruptly that he knocked the table with his knee, making the microphones crackle with static. "Mr. Mercer," he called out, his voice clipping through the speakers, "if you would, walk him for me. Slowly. One pass around the ring." Jack glanced toward the official's box, then gave a slight nod. He lifted his hand, and Titan stepped off beside him. No rope, no fuss. The giant shadow paced at a human speed. Sand sighed under his hooves. The stallion's head was low, not in a submissive way, but in a measured, respectful one, as if he were honoring something older than banners and score sheets. As Titan passed the judge's box, Reeves leaned toward his colleagues. "Look," he muttered, just loud enough for a nearby camera to catch the words. The placement of the feet, the tracking up, the cadence in the lift, and there. He gestured to Titan's hindquarters, to a faint crescent-shaped scar that was only visible when his powerful muscles stretched. "You see that mark, and the way he sits to turn? That's not typical draft horse movement. That's an imprint. That's iron stride." The words fell like a stone into still water. The ripple raced through the steward line and into the first rows of spectators. The name repeated like a question and an answer. Iron stride. Iron stride. Emma's heart kicked hard against her ribs. She looked for Ryan in the crowd, couldn't find him, then looked back at Titan and saw not just her horse, but a story walking out of the past and into the light. A voice rose from the stands, older, roughened by too many dry Kansas summers. "I know that horse." Heads turned as a white-bearded man pushed himself to his feet, his hands gripping the rail in front of him, so hard his knuckles blanched. His eyes were wet and blazing, with a fierce, unbelievable light. "I know him," he said, and his voice carried, though he had no microphone. "He's the last of Celestia's line." The announcer stammered, "Sir, please—" But the crowd parted like grass in the wind as the old man made his careful way down the stairs. people steadying him without being asked. He reached the gate, where a steward helped him. He offered his name like it was something of great weight. "Samuel Price," he said. "I bred the iron strides, before the storm took everything, before men who cared more for money than for blood took the rest." Jack stood very still in the center of the ring. Titan had stopped of his own accord. Samuel walked toward the stallion with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching a holy relic he never thought he'd see again. His hands hovered, shaking, before he finally dared to lay them on Titan's thick mane. The horse lowered his head the smallest fraction. It wasn't submission to the old man. It was something deeper, a recognition without a memory to pin it on, the scent of hands that had once fed his kin, the cadence of a voice he didn't know he knew. Samuel's face crumpled. "Celestia," he whispered, as if the horse's mother, a ghost from years past, stood there in the ring with them. "You were with Foal when the storm came. They said you were lost. They said there was nothing left to find." He stroked Titan's jaw. "They lied. Or maybe we just weren't allowed to find the truth." The stadium briefly, wildly, forgot it was a stadium. Some people were crying softly, without being sure why. Others just swallowed hard against the lump in their throats. Reeves didn't interrupt. He watched, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed, counting timelines and rumors in his head like beads on a string. The string snapped when Ryan Holt shouldered his way through the stewards and stepped into the ring without waiting for permission. He didn't look at the judges first. He looked straight at Victor Kane, at the tight, angry set of the man's mouth as he gripped the VIP rail. "My father served with Jack Mercer," Ryan said, his voice not loud, but steady enough to reach every ear in the silent arena. "He told me stories, stories not meant for polite company. Some were about war, some were about what men do when money is on the line." A nervous murmur prickled across the seats. "Years ago," Ryan continued, "a storm hit this state hard, tore half of it to ribbons. The iron stride herd disappeared in that storm. We were all told it was an act of God." He turned his face to the camera nearest him so the world could read his lips, even if the microphone failed him. It wasn't. Victor's expression didn't change, but a muscle at his jaw flickered. "My father was on a supply run, the next county over," Ryan said. "He heard what the other haulers heard. Orders, whispered down a chain, leave the heavy stock, let the weather do what some men are too cowardly to sign their names to. Those orders were traced back to a ranch that stood to profit when the iron stride line was gone. A ranch that wanted the market cleared for its own shiny pedigrees and its quick returns." Ryan lifted a hand and pointed, not dramatically, but like a man identifying a specimen in a lab. "Victor Kane gave those orders." The entire arena inhaled as one. It didn't exhale. Victor laughed once, a short, sharp bark meant to dismiss everything as a ridiculous rumor. "That's an old tale," he said, raising his voice so it carried. "A story built by people who couldn't handle a little bad weather. You bring slander into my sport now, just because a big horse took a few tidy steps. Shame on you, Dr. Holt, and shame on your father for feeding a boy bedtime fables. He might have gotten away with it. He might have been able to dismiss it with contempt. But his son was sweating." Logan had gone very still, the straw in his drink forgotten. The camera found his face, because a camera knows a story when it sees one. Judge Reeves's gaze pinned Logan with the practiced patience of a man who was accustomed to watching lies hatch under pressure. Samuel turned his head slowly, the grief on his face clearing just enough to make room for a cold, righteous anger. "You left them," he said, "not to Logan, not even to Victor, but to the air itself. You left my mares crying for their foals." "Enough," Victor snapped. "It isn't," Ryan said quietly. The silence unspooled a few more inches. Logan tried to fill it with the same arrogant grin that had served him for years. But it failed. It wobbled and died on his lips. He swallowed hard and looked anywhere but at his father. The crowd could smell the fear on him. "Logan," Judge Reeves said, his voice as gentle as a pastor's, "do you know anything about what happened last night? About some hay that could burn a horse's mouth like a lie?" Emma's fingers tightened on the rail until her knuckles went white. She could feel Jack, even though he stood a dozen yards away down in the ring. She could feel the way his body readied itself for pressure before it turned into motion. Logan opened his mouth, then closed it again. He wiped his sweaty palms on his expensive trousers. The pause felt like a minute. It was 3 seconds. "My father," he faltered. Victor's head whipped toward him, his eyes blazing. Logan flinched as if from a physical blow. "My father. He told me to get rid of a bag. He said it was nothing. He said it would make the big horse too jumpy to go on. He told me—" He swallowed again, the words working their way up through a thick tar of fear and guilt. "He told me to put it where that stall would find it." The sound that rose from the crowd wasn't a cheer or a jeer. It was something older, something more primal. It was the murmur of a crowd deciding what kind of people they were. Then the volume came, harsh and bright. Boos cracked like thunder. Someone shouted, "Cowards!" while others hissed, the way animals do when they finally recognize a predator in their midst. Victor's mask of calm superiority finally slipped. "You idiot!" he snarled at his son, but the microphone picked it up, and so did the front row, and then so did the rest of the world. Judge Reeves didn't need a gavel. His voice landed like one. "Mr. Kane," he said, and the "Mr." was more lethal than a string of curses. "You and your entire operation are suspended from this competition, effective immediately. We will be forwarding all evidence to the governing bodies for further action regarding sabotage and historical misconduct. Security will escort you from the grounds." "This is outrageous," Victor barked, but 2 uniformed security men were already moving toward the VIP box, not roughly, not ceremonially, but with a practiced firmness that said, "We do this more often than we'd like." One of them gestured to Logan. The younger man stared at the sand below, then stood and walked, because he didn't know what else to do when that many eyes were asking the question, "Who are you now?" Bottles didn't fly, this wasn't that kind of crowd, but plastic cups did, and harsh words, and a single cowboy hat flew like a badly aimed planet and skittered across the VIP floor. The platform that had looked like a throne an hour before now looked like a small raft being pitched on a very big, very angry sea, and through it all Titan stood as if the ring were a quiet pasture back home. He flicked an ear at a whistle. He breathed. Jack put a hand to the stallion's neck again, not to comfort him, but to complete the circle between them. He felt Emma's eyes find him across the distance. He felt Samuel's ragged breath hitch. He felt the thrum of Ryan's pulse finally returning to normal as the adrenaline bled out. "Mr. Mercer," Reeves said, his voice softening as if he was remembering that there were living hearts in the ring with his rulings. "You may continue in this competition, and whatever else today brings, this ring will remember what we saw here." Jack didn't look at the judge's box. He stepped closer to Titan until his shoulder was pressed against the horse's powerful jaw. The microphone didn't catch his words, but Emma did, because she knew the shape of them without having to hear the sound. "We brought the truth into the daylight," he told Titan. "That's enough for now." Titan blew a long, steady breath through his nostrils, a sound like a blacksmith's bellows settling. It wasn't a nod, but it felt like one. Up in the stands, the audience finally exhaled. The day had started with mockery, moved through awe and fallen into anger. Now it was rising toward something that felt a lot like justice. Phones were lowered, not because there was nothing left to record, but because some moments asked not to be captured, only to be held. Samuel stayed where he was, one hand still buried in Titan's mane, as if he were leaning on a long-lost gravestone that had suddenly, miraculously, warmed under his palm. Ryan finally let his shoulders drop and met Jack's eyes. The look that passed between them was brief, and it was full of a shared history they hadn't even known they had. Emma wiped her face with the back of her wrist and let out a little hiccup that was half laugh, half sob. Jack looked up at her, and the distance between the rail and the ring felt smaller than a single step. The announcer tried to find his voice, and failed twice before it came out, steady and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we'll be taking a short recess." But no one moved right away. They were all still looking at the giant horse and the quiet man beside him, trying to understand how the world had changed 4 times in as many minutes. They would need a lifetime to explain it properly. They would need no time at all to remember. Jack stroked Titan once more and started for the gate. The stallion followed, Not behind, not ahead, but exactly at his shoulder, exactly where he belonged. The ring had barely settled from the storm of revelation when the judges gathered again. Alan Reeves bent his head close to the others, their words exchanged quick and clipped, their hands gesturing, once, twice, decisive. The crowd leaned in, as if their collective will could catch the whispers across the distance. At last, Reeves straightened, the microphone in his hand. His voice rang out, steady and clear across the arena. "This horse," he declared, "will continue." The stands erupted. Cheers broke like waves against a shore. People who had doubted, who had mocked, who had sneered just hours ago were now on their feet, applauding the decision. Their voices were a raw, powerful mixture of awe and a thirst for justice. Emma clutched the rail, tears already prickling at the corners of her eyes. Jack stood in the ring beside Titan, one hand resting on the stallion's powerful neck. As he walked past Emma on his way out, he rested his other hand on her shoulder for just a moment. "We're not finished yet," he told her quietly. Emma just nodded, her lips pressed together in a tight, determined line. She believed him. Behind the gates, chaos churned. Other teams bustled with their tack and their elaborate costumes. Trainers were snapping orders while assistants adjusted sequins and ran through lighting cues. Their horses gleamed, their manes plaited, their hooves polished to a high shine. Every single detail was fussed over until nothing looked truly alive, only perfect. Jack did none of that. He tightened the strap of his father's old saddle, then loosened it again, and then, finally, he took it off altogether. He looked at Emma, who was waiting with wide, questioning eyes. "They're going to try and blind the crowd with fire," Jack said simply, "but we don't need fire. Titan is enough." Emma frowned. "No saddle? No bridle?" "No bridle," Jack confirmed, running a hand along Titan's powerful jaw. "No rope, no whips, no tricks. Just trust, just what he already is." She bit her lip for a second, and then her face broke into a small, fierce smile. "That's more than enough." The announcer's voice rang out, deep and ceremonial. "And now for our final competitor, Jack Mercer and Titan." Music floated over the arena. It wasn't a raucous, crowd-pleasing tune this time. It was low and mournful, a simple melody on a fiddle and a guitar, each note stretched out like a long shadow at dusk. Jack stepped into the sand, not leading, but simply walking. And Titan followed, a living mountain moving at his shoulder. There was no tether between them. The crowd hushed, the kind of absolute silence that happens when the entire world narrows down to a single point of focus. Jack stopped. He shifted his hip. Titan stopped too. His massive chest was steady, his ears pricked forward. A soft ripple of disbelief moved through the stands. Jack inclined his head toward the audience, and Titan mirrored him, one heavy foreleg easing forward, his head dipping in a gesture that looked for all the world like a formal bow. A collective gasp ran the length of the rails. Emma's heart was beating so hard she could feel the pulse in her palms where she was clutching her sketchbook. Her breath caught in her throat. They see him now, she thought. They really see him. Jack pivoted lightly. Titan turned with him. There was no delay, no pull, no command. A murmur swelled as the horse paused on an invisible cue, stepped forward on another, then curled his neck in what looked like pure deference. Every motion was exact, measured not by force, but by a deep, silent listening. The song rose in volume. Jack gave nothing more than a slight tilt of his shoulders, a soft, almost imperceptible lift of his hand. Titan flowed sideways again, his steps long and sure, the sand whispering under his hooves. He halted, raised his head, then lowered it again, as though he was bowing once more to the quiet music. Not a single sound came from the stands, not even a cough. Emma stood pressed against the rail, her knuckles white, her eyes bright with unshed tears. For once she wasn't sketching. She couldn't. She could only watch, her whole body straining toward the moment. The climax of the song was approaching, like a storm moving in from the horizon. Jack felt the music swell. He stepped back slowly, his body aligned, his eyes fixed on the giant before him. "Now," he whispered, though Titan needed no words. The stallion stopped, his muscles bunched, and then he lifted. Slowly, deliberately, impossibly, Titan raised his forelegs from the ground, his incredible bulk balanced on the sheer power of his haunches, rising, rising, until the sky itself seemed to bend around him. Gasps cracked from every row. A child squealed and was quickly hushed by an awestruck parent. People froze, afraid to even blink, afraid the vision would disappear. Titan held the pose, his mane spilled forward like a black banner, his hooves tucked close to his chest, his powerful body arched. He was balancing not with desperation, but with a serene, absolute control. A dancer wearing the body of a giant. The moment stretched on, long enough to etch itself into the memory of every person there. Then, with a grace that was even more shocking than the rise itself, Titan lowered himself back to the earth. Each hoof touched the sand gently, without a thud or a stumble. He dipped his head low, bowing deeper than he had before, and the arena imploded. Cheers roared, wild and unmeasured. Hats flew into the air. People stomped their feet. They clapped their hands raw. Cameras flashed until the ring was strobing with light. Some spectators were crying openly, the tears sliding unashamed down their cheeks. Others were just shouting words that tangled into a single joyful noise. Jack stood motionless, his chest rising and falling hard, his eyes wet, though he would never admit it. Titan blew a deep exhale through his nostrils, his ears flicking forward as though he was asking, "Was that enough?" "Yes," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "More than enough." Judge Reeves rose once again, but this time his stern face broke into something rarely seen. A smile, wide and genuine and full of wonder. He raised both of his arms. "Ladies and gentlemen, the horse of the year, Titan." The audience surged to their feet again, and his voice had to shout to be heard over the storm of their approval. "And for the bond we have all been privileged to witness, for proving that trust and dignity are the highest form of art, the Performance of Honor Award goes to Jack Mercer." The noise was like thunder, shaking the very boards of the grandstand. The cameras blinded them. The announcer's voice was nearly drowned out as he repeated the names, the awards. Emma was sobbing now, with laughter and pride all mixed together, hugging her sketchbook so tightly the cover bent. And then she couldn't hold back anymore. She bolted through the gate, her feet slipping in the deep sand, tears of joy shining on her face. "Dad!" she cried, and flung herself into Jack's arms. He caught her, lifting her off the ground, despite the deep ache in his shoulder, despite the limp that he knew would punish him later. He held her tight as her words came out, muffled against his chest. "Now who dares to laugh at us?" Jack closed his eyes, pressed his face against her hair, and nodded once. "No one, baby. No one." Titan stepped forward, lowering his great head until it brushed against Jack's back and Emma's shoulder. For an instant, the three of them stood linked in a circle the size of eternity. The cameras flashed again, but the photograph that truly mattered wasn't captured by any lens. It was etched forever in the eyes of every soul present. A broken soldier, a stubborn daughter, and a giant horse who had carried them both into legend. The roar of the classic still echoed in newspapers and living rooms for days after Titan's final silent bow. But for Victor Kane, the sound had curdled into something else entirely. The headlines were merciless. "Sabotage at the classic. The fall of a kingmaker. A poisoned legacy." Local stations ran the footage of Jack's quiet, dignified performance on a loop, then cut to grainy shots of Victor being escorted from the grounds, his face a mask of cold fury. Talk shows replayed Logan's trembling confession over and over again, the son who had thrown his father's empire into ruin with a handful of whispered words. The sponsors fled first. By the end of the week, Kane Ranch had lost every major contract. By the end of the month, state investigators announced formal charges: animal cruelty, fraud, sabotage. Reporters camped outside the ranch gates, their cameras pointed at the new padlocks on the front doors. The Kansas Tribune summed it all up in a single brutal headline: "The Fall of a Horse King." Logan disappeared. His name slipped from auction lists, from competition rosters, from the whispered conversations in stables and bars. He left behind only silence, a cautionary tale to be told by trainers when young riders with too much ambition dreamed too loud. Victor Kane's empire had crumbled to ash. For Jack, silence was all he wanted, but silence did not last long. 1 week after the classic, Samuel Price arrived at the farmhouse. He carried a box of old papers that looked older than Titan himself. He set them gently on Jack's kitchen table, their yellowed edges curling like autumn leaves. "These," Samuel said, his voice rasping with age and emotion, "are the records of the Iron Stride, pedigrees, notes on temperament, training manuals the military once commissioned, back when they thought giants could carry war on their backs." Jack leafed through them carefully. The ink had bled in places, but the names were still legible. Celestia, Stormbreaker, Ironhide. The lines were traced like maps of a forgotten kingdom. Samuel's eyes glistened. "Titan is the last one. He's Celestia's colt, the one I thought I'd lost forever when the storm tore down my fences. If it wasn't for you." His voice cracked. He looked away, his throat bobbing. Jack closed the heavy ledger. "What do you want from me, Samuel?" "Not from you," Samuel corrected gently. "With you." He gestured toward the window, toward Titan's dark silhouette grazing peacefully in the corral. "Help me build something again, not just for him, for all the ones that get cast aside. Iron Stride Ranch." He laid out his vision, his old hands trembling, but his eyes burning with a new fire. A sanctuary for abandoned workhorses, a program where veterans with ghosts in their sleep could come and lay their hands on something steady, breathing, and alive. A schoolyard where children could learn that strength is not always loud and that beauty is not always polished. Jack rubbed his old scar, his gaze fixed on the wood grain of the table. "I came home to vanish, Samuel. To live quiet. Not to make banners out of my name." Emma, who had been listening from the doorway, came and touched his arm. Her eyes were bright with a conviction that was far older than her 14 years. "Dad," she whispered, "you saved Titan when no one else believed in him. Why stop there? There are others out there waiting. Don't let him be the only one." Jack met her gaze. Her hand was small, but her grip was as strong as iron. He saw his wife in her then, the same stubborn hope, the same fierce insistence that broken things deserved mending. He sighed, a long, slow sound. "Iron Stride Ranch," he repeated, as if testing the taste of the words. They didn't feel like a burden. They felt like a beginning. News spreads as fast as gossip always does in small towns, and even wider when the cameras love a story. Titan, the horse they had once mocked, now filled columns from Kansas City to Washington. Journalists dubbed him the Gentle Giant. Videos of his performance racked up millions of views. And visitors started to come, first out of curiosity, then out of need. Veterans with sleepless eyes traveled for hours just to stand at Titan's fence. Some would reach out a tentative hand, then break down when the great stallion lowered his head into their palms. One man, who hadn't slept for more than 2 hours a night in a decade, leaned his forehead against Titan's powerful shoulder and exhaled, tears cutting clean rivers down his dust-cracked face. "That's the first deep breath I've taken since Fallujah," he whispered. Children came too, clutching notebooks and sketch pads, their eyes wide. Emma led them into the barn, showing them how to brush with long, gentle strokes, how to speak softly, how to listen. She knelt beside a boy who was so shy he couldn't meet anyone's gaze. At first, he wouldn't even touch Titan. A week later, he was standing on his tiptoes to braid a piece of the stallion's mane, grinning as if he'd just grown 3 inches taller. The truth didn't need cameras. The word spread from mouth to mouth, and the farm became a kind of pilgrimage. Families would drive in on weekends just to watch Titan walk the fields, to stand in the silence and remember that gentleness could live in giants. Jack found himself speaking less, but smiling more. He shoveled stalls, mended fences, and poured coffee for veterans who told their stories half in words and half in the silences in between. Titan was no longer just his horse. He belonged to everyone who needed him. And Jack discovered something he hadn't expected. Belonging didn't diminish love, it multiplied it. One evening, as spring was drifting toward summer and the air was filled with the hum of cicadas and the scent of fresh-turned earth, Jack walked Titan out into the open fields. The sun was sliding low, painting the Kansas sky in streaks of orange and rosefire. Titan's shadow stretched long across the grass, a colossus stitched to the land. Emma and Samuel lingered by the fence, watching but not intruding. They understood that a man might need solitude, even in his joy. Jack stopped at the rise where the prairie seemed to fall away into forever. He set his hand on Titan's neck, the warmth of the horse grounding him. For a long moment he simply stood there, listening to the sound of breath, of heartbeat, of wind. Then he leaned close, whispering so softly the words were nearly part of the air itself. "It wasn't because they stopped laughing," he said, his throat tight. "It's because we learned how to stand. Anyway." Titan flicked an ear. He lifted his head against the dying light, his calm eyes reflecting the flame of the sunset, without fear. He gave a single toss of his head, his mane scattering sunfire, then stilled again, steady as the earth itself. Behind them, the new barn was rising, built with fresh boards and a clean new sign that caught the last blaze of the evening. Iron Stride Ranch. The camera in Jack's mind pulled back. The fields rolled wide. The house, patched and freshly painted, glowed with lamplight. The barn stood proud. And Titan and Jack remained at the crest of the hill, two figures against the vast canvas of the sky, two survivors fading into the horizon together. The story was closing, not in silence, but in a quiet, powerful hope. A hope built from scars, from survival, and from the unbreakable tether between a soldier, his daughter, and a horse that the world had once left for dead. And as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the Kansas sky swallowed them in gold, leaving behind a legacy not of victory alone, but of endurance, of gentleness, and of standing tall when the world expected you to fall. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this incredible story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what your favorite part was. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories just like this one. And hey, don't miss out. Hit that notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.